The dinner that changed everything the night was cool and quiet. When Sundar Pichai walked into the little Italian restaurant at the corner of a narrow street in San Francisco, the lights inside were warm and golden. The sound of laughter mixed with soft music. It had been a long day of meetings, phone calls, and decisions that carried the weight of thousands of lives. He just wanted a quiet dinner before flying back to Mountain View. No one seemed to notice him. That was how he liked it. The hostess smiled and led him to a table by the window. Outside, people hurried by, but Sundar just sat there for a moment, letting the calm of the place settle over him. He ordered a simple plate of pasta and a glass of water. While waiting, he thought about his mother back in India, how she would always tell him never to forget where he came from. He thought about the factory where his father worked and how he used to ride his bicycle every day past the big steel gates to bring his father lunch. The memory made him smile faintly. The food came. It was delicious. Each bite reminded him how lucky he was to have this life now. But as he reached for his wallet to pay, something happened that he would never forget. He handed the waiter his credit card, and the man took it with a polite nod. A few minutes later, the waiter returned, his face a little tense. He leaned down and whispered so no one else would hear. "I'm sorry, sir, but your card was declined." Sundar blinked, confused. He thought he misheard. "Excuse me," he asked gently. "The card. It didn't go through," the waiter repeated, lowering his eyes. "Would you like to try another one?" Sundar's cheeks grew warm. People at nearby tables were starting to glance at him. He reached into his wallet and found another card. But when the waiter ran it, the same thing happened. Declined. The air in the restaurant felt heavier now, and Sundar could feel a knot forming in his stomach. He stood there, trying to explain, but something about the waiter's expression stopped him. There was no anger there, no mockery, only quiet concern. The waiter leaned closer and whispered, "Sir, are you okay? If you need more time, take it. No rush." The kindness in his voice surprised Sundar more than the situation itself. He nodded, but inside, his thoughts raced. He knew the cards should work. Something must have gone wrong with the bank or the system. But the longer he stood there, the more he could feel the eyes of strangers on him, some curious, some judging. And for the first time in a long while, Sundar felt small again, like the boy in Chennai who used to count every coin before buying a snack. Just then, a voice from across the room called out, "Is everything all right here?" It was a woman with sharp eyes, wearing an expensive suit. She was watching him intently. Sundar felt a shiver of unease. Before he could answer, she got up and walked toward him. When she reached his table, she smiled faintly, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. "You're Sundar Pichai, aren't you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, interesting," she said, her smile widening. "Very interesting." The waiter looked nervous now. The woman pulled out her phone and started typing something as she glanced at him. "Well," she continued, "you're in quite a situation here. Aren't you curious to know why this happened?" Sundar stared at her, confused. "Do you know something about it?" She looked at him as if weighing his soul. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "Oh yes, and it's only the beginning." The word sent a chill through him. He opened his mouth to ask more, but before he could speak, she slipped a folded card onto his table and walked away. No explanation, no further glance. The waiter stood frozen, watching her leave. Sundar picked up the card and opened it. Inside was a single line written in neat, dark ink. "If you want answers, meet me at the pier at midnight. Come alone." Heart pounded as he stared at the message. He looked up to see if the woman was still there, but she had disappeared into the crowd. The restaurant felt strange now. Everyone seemed to be watching him, though no one really was. He slipped the card into his pocket and sat down again, staring out the window. Outside, the street was dark and quiet, but something in the air felt different now, heavier, more dangerous. He didn't know why his card was declined or who that woman was, but something deep inside told him his life was about to change forever, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what was coming. He left the restaurant without finishing his water, his mind full of questions. As he stepped into the night, he felt the cold wind on his face and pulled his jacket tighter. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower began to chime. Midnight was only a few hours away, and he was already starting to wonder if meeting her at the pier would be the biggest mistake of his life. The woman at the pier. Night air wrapped around Sundar like a thin, restless fog as he walked toward the pier. The streets of San Francisco glimmered under rows of yellow lamps, but their light did nothing to ease the growing unease in his chest. Every step he took seemed to echo louder than it should have. His shoes tapped the wooden boards of the pier, the sound sharp and lonely. The city behind him buzzed with distant laughter, car horns, and music spilling out from bars. But here, it was different. Here, it was quiet. Too quiet. He had left the restaurant earlier without looking back, clutching the little card in his pocket as if it might disappear if he let go of it. He didn't even bother calling his assistant or checking his phone. For some reason, the idea of telling anyone about this strange encounter felt impossible, almost forbidden. Even now, as he neared the end of the pier, his mind wrestled with questions he couldn't answer. Who was the woman? How did she know his name? What did she mean when she said it's only the beginning? And why did his two cards fail when he knew very well they were fine? The water below the wooden planks lapped softly against the supports, dark and endless, carrying with it a salty chill that cut through his jacket. The moon hung low in the sky, round and pale, reflected on the black waves. As he walked closer to the end of the pier, he noticed a figure already standing. There, her silhouette etched against the horizon like a painting. She didn't move. She didn't even turn her head as he approached. When he finally stopped a few steps behind her, he could see her more clearly. She wore the same sharp suit from earlier, her hair tied back neatly. She stood with her hands, resting lightly on the railing, staring out into the ocean. Her posture was calm, almost casual, but Sundar could feel something tightly coiled beneath her stillness, like a snake waiting to strike. He cleared his throat. "I'm here," he said, his voice soft but steady. She didn't turn around. Instead, she spoke without looking at him. "You came. Good. Not everyone does." "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep the impatience out of his tone. "What is this about?" Slowly she turned her head just enough for him to see her profile. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, dark and sharp, glimmered with something he couldn't quite name. "You've built a life where people bow when you enter a room," she said calmly. "You've climbed higher than most men ever dream, and yet, here you are, alone, confused, afraid." The words stung because they were true. Sundar's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't respond. She finally turned to face him fully, crossing her arms. "There are things happening, Mr. Pichai," she continued, her voice low and measured. "Things you're not supposed to see. Not yet. But sometimes, life has a way of forcing your eyes open." He narrowed his gaze. "What does that mean? What do you want from me?" The woman stepped closer, so close now that he could see the faintest scar just above her eyebrow, and the cold resolve etched in her features. She pulled something from the pocket of her suit, a small black envelope, and held it out to him. "This," she said simply. Sundar hesitated before taking it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, and warm, as if it had been resting against her skin for hours. He opened it carefully, his fingers slightly trembling. Inside was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, and the words written there made his stomach drop. "You have been chosen. You will understand everything in 3 days. If you refuse to follow what is coming, you will lose everything you hold dear." He looked up at her sharply. "Chosen? Chosen for what?" She only smiled faintly. "You'll know soon enough." But before that, she paused, then reached into her jacket again, pulling out what looked like a small leather notebook. She handed it to him, and he could see that the cover was cracked and worn, as if it had passed through many hands before his. "Read this tonight," she instructed, "but only when you're alone. Every word in there matters. And when you're done, burn it." He stared at the notebook, then back at her. "And if I don't?" For the first time that evening, her expression hardened, her jaw tightened, and her eyes turned almost cold. "If you don't," she said slowly, "then everything you think you've built, your company, your family, your name, will crumble around you. You won't even see it coming." Sundar's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand answers, but she raised a finger sharply, silencing him. "Not tonight," she said, her tone final. "Tonight, you go home, read, and remember. At dawn, everything changes." Then, without another word, she stepped past him and began walking back down the pier, her heels clicking softly on the wooden boards. He watched her go, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. He glanced down at the notebook in his hands. The leather felt rough, worn by years of handling. He flipped it open just enough to see the first page, and his breath hitched. The first line was written in the same neat ink as the card from the restaurant. "We know what you did 22 years ago." His fingers tightened around the notebook as a sudden wave of fear and confusion washed over him. 22 years ago. Back then he was just a young man in Chennai, struggling to finish his studies and dreaming of a better life. What could they possibly know from that time? He looked back down the pier, but the woman was already gone, swallowed by the night. Only the sound of the ocean remained, steady and uncaring. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the notebook, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He could feel the faint tremor in his fingers now. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something darker. Finally, he slipped the notebook into his coat pocket and turned toward the city. He began walking back slowly, each step heavier than the last. His mind churned with memories he hadn't thought about in years. Shadows of mistakes and regrets he had buried long ago. What could she mean? What did they know? And who were they anyway? As he neared the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a single message from an unknown number. "We're watching you. Don't be late." He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the screen until it went dark again. A strange feeling of dread settled over him. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that tonight had marked the beginning of something he couldn't escape. And he also knew that when dawn came, he would never see the world the same way again. He walked on, the city lights blurring around him, the sound of the waves still echoing faintly in his ears. And behind him, in the shadows of the pier, a figure watched silently until he disappeared from view. Asterisk, the notebook of secret Sundar did not go home right away. Instead, he walked the streets for nearly an hour, lost in thought, until the city around him grew quieter and lonelier. The lights of San Francisco blurred into streaks of yellow and red as his mind replayed every detail of the strange encounter. At the pier, the woman's sharp eyes, her calm voice, the ominous envelope, the words on the first page of the notebook. We know what you did 22 years ago. By the time he unlocked the door to his apartment, the moon had already begun its slow descent behind the hills. The familiar space greeted him with silence, but tonight it felt different, emptier somehow. He placed the notebook carefully on the coffee table, sat on the edge of the couch, and stared at it for a long time without touching it again. Thought about the 22 years that separated him from his boyhood in how hard he had worked to escape the tiny apartment where he grew up, the cracked walls that let in the summer heat, the nights he stayed awake counting coins under a single bulb. He thought about the scholarships, the sleepless nights of study, the quiet determination that drove him across oceans. To him, those years had been full of struggle but not of shame, or so he believed. Finally, he reached out and opened the notebook again. The leather creaked faintly in the quiet room. The first page was still there with its chilling sentence. Below it, more words waited in the same precise handwriting. Before you were Sundar Pichai, the man they admire, you were simply Sundar, and you made a choice that night. A choice that someone never forgot. Read carefully. Every detail matters. His hands felt colder now. He turned the page, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was a photograph. Old, faded, the corners worn. It showed a narrow alleyway he hadn't seen in decades, but recognized instantly. The alley behind the engineering college in Chennai, he could almost smell it now. The dampness of stone walls, the faint aroma of spices drifting from nearby homes. In the photograph, two figures stood at the far end of the alley. One of them, unmistakably, was him. He stared at the photo for a long time. The boy in the picture wore a thin shirt and held a notebook under his arm. His face was partly turned away, but Sundar knew his own posture, his own shoulders. And next to him stood another boy, taller, lean, with his hand raised as if pointing toward something out of frame. Sundar squinted at the face, trying to remember, but the name wouldn't come. Beneath the photo, a note was written. You know who he was. You know what happened next. Don't lie to yourself. Sundar. Single quotes as heart pounded faster. He turned the next page, hoping for clarity, but instead, more memories rushed up to meet him. This page contained a written account, dated March 2003, written in the same neat hand. You were late to class that day. You walked through the alley to save time. You saw him waiting there, angry, desperate. You remember his name, Arjun. He begged you for help, and you turned away. You didn't look back, but you heard what happened seconds later. You heard the crash. You heard the scream, and you never spoke of it again. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. The name struck him like a thunderclap. Arjun, yes, of course. He hadn't thought of Arjun in years, but now the memory came flooding back in painful clarity. Arjun had been one of the quiet boys in his class, always sitting at the back, always scribbling equations on scraps of paper. That day Sundar remembered now, he had been standing in the alley, blocking Sundar's path. His eyes had been red, his hands trembling. He said he needed help. Something about owing someone money, something about people coming for him. But Sundar, late for an exam, had brushed past him, told him he couldn't help. And then the sound, a car screeching, a scream. Sundar pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes as if trying to push the memory away, but the notebook wouldn't let him. On the next page, another photograph waited. This time, Arjun lay on the ground, his face twisted in pain. A crowd gathering around him. Sundar felt his stomach churn. Beneath the photo was another message. You walked away before the ambulance came. You pretended you saw nothing. You built your future on the silence of that moment. And someone has been watching ever since. He dropped the notebook on the table and stood up, his hands shaking. He paced the room, trying to breathe. His mind reeled. Could it really be that simple? A single mistake, a single act of selfishness, could it have stayed with him all these years? And who could have possibly known? His phone buzzed on the couch, startling him. He picked it up to see another message from the same unknown number. Page 15. Read now. His hands trembled as he picked up the notebook again and flipped to page 15. This page was entirely blank, except for a single line in the center. Arjun is alive. He remembers, and he is waiting for you. The words hit him like a punch. He sank into the couch, his mind racing. Arjun alive, after all these years. How could that be? Below the sentence was another note. Midnight tomorrow. The train station, platform 3. Come alone. If you don't, the world will know what you did. Sundar stared at the page until the words blurred. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence of the room. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn painted the sky in pale blue. He closed the notebook carefully, placed it back on the table, and sat there, motionless. His eyes burned, but he didn't cry. Instead, his mind kept replaying that day, the look in Arjun's eyes, the sound of tires skidding, the sickening crunch, the way he turned his back and kept walking because he couldn't afford to stop. He thought about all the times he had told himself that he had done what he had to, that he had no choice. But now, sitting here, he wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. When the sun finally rose, casting light across the room, Sundar was still sitting there, the notebook heavy in his lap, and in his chest, a quiet dread began to grow. Knew he couldn't ignore this. Tomorrow at midnight, he would go to the station, and he would face whatever, or whoever was waiting for him there. The man on platform 3 hours after sunrise passed like a blur. Sundar moved through the motions of the day, as if he were underwater. He sat through meetings, nodded at presentations, and answered emails. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. Every time he looked at the clock, his heart clenched a little tighter. With each tick of the second hand, midnight crept closer, and with it, the promise of the train station and the man who had been waiting for 22 years. By the time he returned to his apartment that evening, the city outside, his window was already cloaked in soft shadows. He stood at the glass for a long time, watching as the lights of San Francisco flickered on one by one, like fireflies in the dark. Cars moved below him, tiny and distant, their headlights glowing. Somewhere far away, a siren wailed, sharp and lonely. He thought again of the notebook, still resting on the coffee table where he'd left it the night before. Though he hadn't opened it again, its presence filled the room like a storm cloud. He didn't need to read it again. Every word was already burned into his mind. Arjun is alive, he remembers, and he is waiting for you, asterisk. He changed into a simple jacket and dark trousers, clothes that would not stand out in a crowd, and slipped the notebook into his pocket. He paused at the door for a moment, his hand on the knob, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't know if he would come back, the same person, but when he finally stepped outside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of the bay. The streets were quieter now, though a few people lingered here and there. Couples walking, hand in hand, delivery riders zipping past, a man smoking under a street. Sundar kept his head down as he made his way to the station. The train station was an old building at the edge of the city. Its brick walls faded and cracked, its windows lined with grime. It was mostly empty at this hour, save for a few tired travelers and a man sweeping the floor in slow circles. The great clock above the entrance ticked loudly, its hands moving closer to midnight with a kind of cruel inevitability. He walked through the wide archway, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the cold tile floor. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust. He glanced at the signs until he found platform 3 and began making his way down the stairs. The platform was dimly lit, a long stretch of concrete flanked by steel tracks that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Here and there, benches lined the walls, empty except for an old woman sleeping with her head on her bag. A train idled far down the line, its engine humming softly, a low, patient growl that filled the silence. He stood at the base of the stairs, scanning the platform. At first he saw nothing, just the sleeping woman, the shadows, and the faint glow of fluorescent bulbs. But then, near the very end of the platform, he saw him. A man sat on a bench, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted slightly as if he had been waiting a long time. He was dressed simply, dark jacket, loose pants, shoes worn thin, and his hair was streaked with gray. Sundar froze, unable to move for a moment. Even from here, he felt it. The weight of recognition. The man lifted his head slowly, and their eyes met. Sundar single quotes, stomach twisted. He knew that face, even after all these years. The lines were deeper, the skin rougher, but the eyes were the same, sharp and searching, filled with something he couldn't quite name. He forced himself to walk forward, each step heavy, each breath shallow. As he drew closer, the man didn't move. He just watched him with a calm that somehow made Sundar's pulse quicken. When he finally stood before the bench, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The man broke the silence first. So, he said, his voice low and rough, "You came after all." Sundar swallowed hard. "Arjun," he said, barely above a whisper. The man's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "You do remember." Sundar nodded slowly, though his chest ached. I didn't know you were alive." Arjun finished for him, leaning back slightly. His eyes glinted. "Yes, alive, though there were days I wished I wasn't." The words cut deeper than Sundar expected. He looked down, unable to meet Arjun's gaze. "I was young," he murmured. I made a mistake." Arjun let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "A mistake," he repeated. "You walked away and left me there, bleeding in the dirt. You didn't even look back. Do you have any idea what came after?" Sundar felt his throat tighten. Arjun leaned forward, his face suddenly close. His voice, a sharp whisper. "They broke my ribs, shattered my leg. I spent months in a hospital that smelled like mold and misery. And when I finally crawled out, everything was gone. My studies, my job prospects, my dignity. You went on to conquer the world, and I was left to rot in the cracks of it." Sundar flinched. The words hit him harder than he expected. His hands trembled at his sides. I thought you, he tried, but the sentence fell apart before it left his lips. Arjun's eyes narrowed. You thought I would disappear, and for a long time, I did. But even in the shadows, I watched you. I saw every step you took, every triumph, every speech about kindness and humility. It was almost funny. A long silence stretched between them. Sundar could hear the faint squeal of brakes as a train somewhere above began to move. Finally, he forced himself to speak. Why now? He asked, his voice breaking just slightly. After all this time, why come for me now? Arjun leaned back again, his fingers tracing the edge of the bench. He tilted his head, studying Sundar as if weighing his soul. Because now you have everything to lose. He said quietly, and I want you to feel what it's like to watch it all slip through your fingers, just like I did. The words sank into Sundar like ice. He felt the weight of them settle in his chest. Arjun stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He was taller than Sundar remembered, his shoulders broad despite the years. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, just like the woman had done before. He held it out without a word. Sundar hesitated, then took it. The paper felt warm, almost alive in his hand. Open it when you get home, Arjun said. Inside is the first step. You'll do exactly as it says, or everything burns. Sid stared at the envelope, then looked back up, but Arjun was already walking away, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. He wanted to call after him, to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, he stood there, frozen, the envelope trembling slightly in his fingers. The old woman on the bench stirred in her sleep. And somewhere down the track, a train let out a long, low whistle. The air around him seemed heavier now, thick with the weight of choices and consequences. He turned and began walking back toward the stairs. The envelope clutched tight in his hand. His mind churned with fear, regret, and a faint, rising anger at himself, at Arjun, at the past he thought he had buried. But as he reached the top of the stairs and stepped out into the night, he felt something shift inside him. Because whatever was in that envelope, he knew it was only the beginning, and deep down. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to pay a price far greater than he could imagine. The first step city was asleep by the time Sundar returned to his apartment. The streets were empty now, washed in moonlight and silence, as though the whole world had agreed to close its eyes and leave him alone in this strange, waking nightmare. He walked slowly, his thoughts tangled in knots he could not untie. In his pocket, the envelope Arjun had given him felt like a stone, small but impossibly heavy, pulling him down with every step. When he finally unlocked his door and stepped inside, the apartment felt colder than usual. He did not turn on the lights right away. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway, leaning against the frame, staring into the dark. The quiet pressed against his ears until he thought he might drown in it. He pulled the envelope out and set it on the coffee table, next to the notebook from the night before. For a long time, he just stared at it. His hands rested on his knees, fingers clenching and unclenching. The air around him thick with questions he was too afraid to ask. He thought of Arjun's voice at the station, low, steady, full of a quiet fury that had simmered for more than 2 decades. You'll do exactly as it says, or everything burns. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, then reached for the envelope. The paper tore softly in the silence, and he slid out a single folded sheet. The handwriting was the same as before, sharp, clean, deliberate. There are 3 steps. The first one starts tonight. You will go to the address below. You will find a man there waiting for you. His name is Ramesh. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will listen. You will do as he says. You have until dawn. Beneath the instructions was an address, written clearly, with no further explanation. Sundar stared at it, the words blurring slightly as fear tightened its grip on his chest. He set the paper down and buried his face in his hands. Somewhere deep inside, he wanted to refuse. He wanted to tear the note in half, throw it away, forget the station, forget Arjun, and go back to the life he knew. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he remembered Arjun's eyes. The quiet, certain way he had said, everything burns. A cold certainty settled in Sundar's stomach. He stood, grabbed his jacket, and slipped the note into his pocket. The streets outside were still empty, though the wind had picked up, sharp and biting now. He hailed a cab and gave the driver the address without looking him in the eye. The car rolled forward, the city passing by in a blur of lights and shadows. The address led him to a part of the city he hadn't seen in years, a neighborhood of narrow streets and low buildings, where the street lamps flickered and the air smelled faintly of smoke. The cab stopped in front of a weathered building with boarded windows and a single dim light above the door. Sundar paid the driver and stepped out, his breath curling in the cold air. He stood in front of the door for what felt like an eternity, his hand hovering just above the knob. Finally, he turned it and pushed inside. The room beyond was lit by a single bulb that swung faintly from the ceiling. The walls were bare, the floor scuffed and stained. At the far end of the room sat a man in a wooden chair, his arms resting loosely on his knees. He was older, with deep lines in his face and a gaze that seemed to see everything at once. "You're late," the man said without looking up. His voice was quiet but carried easily in the stillness. Sundar closed the door behind him and stepped forward. "I came as fast as I could," he said. The man Ramesh, he assumed, finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, dark, and unflinching. "Sit," Ramesh said simply, gesturing to a chair opposite him. Sundar sat. The wood creaked under his weight. The silence stretched between them until Ramesh leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't know why you're here," he said. It wasn't a question. Sundar shook his head. Ramesh studied him for a long moment, then spoke. "There are debts," he said finally. "Debts that do not fade just because you choose to forget them. You walked away 22 years ago, and a boy paid your price. Now, it's your turn to carry it." Sundar swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Ramesh didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal box, which he set between them. It was plain, unmarked, but the way he handled it made Sundar's skin prickle. Inside, Ramesh said, "is everything you need for the first step. You will take it. You will deliver it to the address written on the paper inside. You will not open the box, you will not speak to anyone along the way, and you will not ask questions. If you succeed, you will get the second step. If you fail," he trailed off, his gaze hardening, and Sundar understood. Failure was not an option. "When do I start?" Sundar asked quietly. Ramesh pushed the box toward him. Now Sundar picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, cold to the touch. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket and stood. Ramesh leaned back in his chair, watching him with a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "You have until sunrise," he said. "Go." Sundar left the room without another word. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, whipping through the narrow streets, carrying with it the faint sound of distant sirens. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and started walking. The address on the slip of paper was several blocks away, a crumbling apartment building at the edge of the neighborhood. The streets here were even emptier, the silence broken only by the occasional clatter of a loose sign or the scurry of a rat across the pavement. As he walked, the box seemed to grow heavier with each step. His mind raced with questions he dared not ask. What was inside? Who was waiting for it? And what would happen if he failed to deliver it? When he finally reached the building, the sky was already beginning to pale at the edges. The first hints of dawn creeping in. He stood before the door, heart pounding, his breath quick and shallow. He raised his hand to knock but stopped when he noticed something. The door was already ajar. He hesitated, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty. No furniture, no sound, just a faint smell of dust and something else, something metallic. On the floor, in the center of the room, lay another envelope, just like the ones before. He picked it up slowly, hands trembling. Inside was a single line of text. "You were followed." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Behind him, the door creaked softly, as though touched by an unseen hand. He turned and saw a shadow move just beyond the doorway. His pulse roared in his ears. He backed into the room, clutching the box to his chest, his eyes fixed on the doorway as the shadow crept closer. And then a voice, calm and quiet, from the darkness. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." The words sent a chill through him deeper than any he had felt before. He took another step back, his mind screaming for answers, but none came. The shadow moved closer still, until he could almost see a figure, tall, deliberate, faceless in the dim light. And before he could speak, before he could even take another breath, the door slammed shut and the room went dark. The choice darkness swallowed the room whole the moment the door slammed shut. Sundar stood frozen, his breath shallow and ragged, the box still clutched tightly to his chest. In the pitch-black silence, he could hear only the pounding of his own heartbeat and the faint creak of the floorboards under invisible feet. Air was colder now, heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. Then, from somewhere just ahead, came the sound of a chair being dragged slowly across the floor. The sound was deliberate, scraping against the wood like a blade. Sundar's hands trembled, and though his body screamed to run, his legs wouldn't move. A faint light appeared at the far end of the room. A single bulb flickered to life, swinging slightly as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Beneath it sat Arjun. He looked older than he had at the station, his face more lined, his hair thinner, but his eyes still carried that quiet, burning fury. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, and watched Sundar with a calm that was far more frightening than anger. Behind him stood two men, their faces hidden in shadow. They were motionless, but Sundar could feel their gaze on him like a weight pressing down. Arjun spoke first, his voice low, measured. "You've done well to get this far," he said. "Most would have broken by now, but not you. Of course not you." Sundar swallowed hard, the box heavy in his hands. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Arjun tilted his head, as though surprised by the question. "Why?" he repeated softly. You really don't understand, even now. He rose slowly from the chair, the light catching his face in a way that made him look both older and somehow more dangerous. He took a step toward Sundar, and then another, until they stood barely an arm's length apart. 22 years ago, Arjun began, his voice steady. You walked away. You left me bleeding in the dirt. You heard me call your name. Heard me beg, and still, you kept walking. That moment was my end. But for you, it was just another day. Sundar shook his head weakly, his words catching in his throat. I was young. I was scared. I didn't know what. Don't. Arjun cut him off sharply. Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know. You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose yourself. The silence that followed was deafening. Sundar felt the truth of it settle deep into his bones, heavier than the box he still carried. Finally, Arjun reached out and placed a hand lightly on the box. Inside, he said, his eyes locking onto Sundar's as the final step. Your choice. Open it. Sundar hesitated, his fingers trembling as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside was not what he expected. There was no money, no weapon, no secret documents. Instead, there were two envelopes, one white, one black. Arjun gestured toward them. Two choices, he said softly. The white envelope contains a confession, a full account of what you did, signed and sealed. If you choose it, you will deliver it to the press yourself. Your career ends tomorrow. Your name becomes mud, but you will have paid your debt. He tapped the black envelope with one finger. The black envelope, he continued, contains proof of my silence. If you choose it, you walk away from this room, and no one will ever hear from me again. No one will know what you did. You keep your life, your power, your name. He stepped back, his gaze unwavering. Choose, and live with it. Sundar stared down at the two envelopes, his breath quick and shallow. His fingers hovered over the white one first, then the black. The weight of both pressed against him. He thought about his life, his family, his company, the people who looked up to him, everything he had built, every sacrifice he had made to get here. He thought about his father, who had worked himself to exhaustion just so Sundar could study, about his mother, who had told him never to forget who he was. And then he thought of Arjun, lying in that alley all those years ago, his eyes wide with fear, his hand reaching out, and how Sundar had turned his back and walked away. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Even the men in the shadows seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Sundar closed his eyes and reached down. He picked up the white envelope. Arjun watched him, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he gave a faint nod, not approval, not forgiveness, but perhaps something closer to acknowledgement. So be it, Arjun said quietly. Sundar opened the envelope and removed the paper inside. His hands shook as he read it. Every word, every sentence, a mirror held up to his worst self. At the bottom was a space for his signature. A pen appeared before him. He didn't even see who had placed it there. He took it and signed. When he set the pen down, Arjun reached forward and took the confession from him. He slipped it back into the envelope and handed it to one of the men in the shadows, who disappeared into the darkness without a word. Arjun met Sundar's eyes one last time. You've paid, he said simply. Now go. Sundar stood there for a moment longer, the room still thick with everything unspoken. Then he turned and walked toward the door. His steps felt heavier now, but somehow steadier. Just before he reached the threshold, voice called after him, soft but clear. Remember this, he said. You don't climb by stepping on others, because one day they'll stand up again. Sundar paused, his back still to the room, then nodded faintly before pushing the door open. Outside, the first light of dawn painted the horizon in hues of gold and rose. The air was cold and clean, and the weight in his chest felt different now. Not gone, but somehow bearable. He slipped the black envelope into his pocket, a reminder of the path he hadn't taken, and began to walk. City around him was waking up. People hurried by, unaware of the man passing among them, carrying both his past and his choice like invisible chains. As he turned the corner, the sun rose fully, casting its light over everything, and for the first time in years, Sundar felt something unexpected. Not pride, not fear, but a quiet kind of peace.